Hello, everybody, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, comrades and friends. My name is Ian Phillips, and I am with the American College of Education as a graduate student. And I am publishing this presentation today here on YouTube for you to watch at your own convenience. So that way we can discuss the relationship between personality and teacher effectiveness. In particular, we're going to be looking at its applications in terms of evaluating teacher candidacy at our given institutions. Whether we are at primary school, secondary school, it doesn't really matter. Now there is going to be some difference in that as we'll talk about as we progress, but I really just want to give you guys today a personality-based framework for evaluating teacher candidates. And the personality framework that we're going to use today is going to be the Big Five personality inventories. We're going to be looking at what Big Five has to offer. We're going to be looking at each individual trait of the Big Five, breaking them down, and we're going to be discussing how they can be used or what we want to look for when we're hiring candidates. And so ideally what would happen is we're going to give them an assessment. They self-assess themselves in terms of personality. We score the results, and we can get a good idea of what their own personality is before we even meet these people. Right, and this is just based on self-assessment. So you do got to take it, so it won't be perfect, right? Because we don't have somebody else assessing them and their character, somebody who knows them very well. But a self-assessment is very accurate, especially in terms for what we're going to want to do, and we can make this automated pretty quickly. And one of the things we could do is we just put it right on like an Apple Track or some other resume platform. Make them take the little screening, and in 15-20 minutes you got a very good picture of a candidate's personality, and then we can use that to determine which candidates are probably going to be the best fit at our own institutions. So having said that, today I just want to give a little bit about my background and what I have done in the past, which makes me qualified to talk on this topic. I was actually a corporate recruiter for 4 years before I got into the field of education, and currently I'm finishing my master's degree up here, and should be finishing it up hopefully in a little bit over a month, and that will be coming along with my principal license in the following year. So having said that, we're going to get into it today, and we got a little overview slide here, and the first thing that we're going to be talking about is how personality tests are made and conducted, right? So we're going to go over what are the steps that are taken to make a personality test, and how do we even know that they're accurate in some ways, right? So I think we might discuss that a little bit. We're going to overview the Big Five personality traits. We're going to give a brief synopsis of what each one is, and in part this is going to come from some research that I previously did when I was at Cleveland State University. I published a paper on Big Five personality traits in political orientation, and had some good success. It's I believe it's one of the more downloaded articles on their journal, and so it was only available to honor students, and I was able to publish in that. And so it was a very, very good experience, and it really opened my eyes a little bit in terms of what I should do for my original contribution here at the American College of Education. Because one of the things that we talked about here at ACE, American College of Education, ACE, is what we did is we took a number of different hiring methods, and we reviewed them, and the best ones were the personality-based hiring methods. And I believe there was an article by Clement, he should be in the references here. It's called Hiring the Best, and I felt that was just a really good article because it really talked about you want to not necessarily look for the achievements more so. It's more so about the personality behind the achievements. And so if we can get access to the raw personality behind our candidates, we can understand the forces that are driving them, these innate proclivities that they have, and we can use that to justify our hiring decisions and hopefully screen for some very good candidates. And this is an extremely hard endeavor to undertake, in particular because there's at least in Northeast Ohio, I guess I can't speak on every single place because I know there are some places that do have teacher shortages. But in Northeast Ohio, for instance, there's only been 10 public school social studies positions open in the last year, and I know this because I check, and there's 300 to 400 applicants per position. So you really have a lot of people coming in, and it's like, how do we differentiate these people, right? And this is just one more way to do that. And I think it shows some very good merit, and it's a non-biased approach, and it has some good efficacy. And so we're going to be talking about that today, and we'll be reading from sections of my paper on personality and political orientation, and it'll just be the sections where we're talking about what each trait is itself, right? What is openness to experience? What is conscientiousness? Right? What is extroversion? Right? What does that mean? A lot of people hear extroversion in the pop culture, but they don't really know what it means in terms of its academic uses. People just think that an extrovert is somebody who likes to go out and party and associate with friends and whatnot, and they are very social. There are socialites, but there's also a completely other aspect to or two other aspects really to extroversion that people are also not taking into consideration, such as positive emotion, as well as their assertiveness. And so we're going to be breaking down each individual trait. We're going to be also breaking it down into their two aspects as well. So you can take each trait and break it down into two other smaller aspects, right? So you almost cut it in half in some ways. And we're going to be talking about that. And so we'll talk about what each trait is, and then we'll give some research-based suggestions for each of the 5 traits. And these suggestions, they're just presenting the data here on the PowerPoint, right? So whatever each trait, whatever the effect size of each trait is, in relationship to teacher effectiveness. So if you have a principal and they say, hey, look, this person is one of our best teachers, right? And it's like, well, how does the big 5 stack up to that, right? We want to know how these traits correlate with teacher effectiveness, right? And so we can figure out by doing the math what traits we want to actually look for in our candidates, and what traits are common amongst all the most effective teachers that are out there. And so we're also going to be looking at school specificity versus research-based approaches. And school specificity is something that's we're going to be harping on that a decent amount when we get into there, but it's not something that's really too complex. But what you really want to think about is school specificity is more so just in terms of if I want to just screen for candidates at my own school, because I'm going to have my own unique culture, I'm going to have my own unique environment, right? And I'm going to have my own unique perceptions in regards to what I think an effective teacher is going to look like. And so if I was a principal and I were to rate my teachers, we're going to say I just know off the top of my head, I know the best 3 teachers according to what my rubrics are telling me, as well as just my own personal intuition. Maybe I take the best 3 teachers, right? And then from there I average out their scores, and it shows they are in whatever percentile of openness or whatever percentile of neuroticism, right? And we can take these their scores, and then we can look for candidates who have similar scores in comparison to the effective teachers as defined by the principal at the school. So we can look at school specificity versus research-based approaches. The research-based approach is just showing us what the literature has to say, right? So you're going to take thousands of candidates, right? And then we're going to test their personalities, as well as gauge their effectiveness in accordance to typically superiors. So this would be like administrators. And then we're going to see how these traits stack up and which traits lead to more effective teachers. So we're just going to be talking about that, and then personal recommendations for assessing candidates on each trait. The reason I want to give some personal recommendations is because I almost don't know if it comes out as clear as it should in the literature, and this was kind of shocking to me. And I included in particular 2 studies that we're going to talk about today. One of them is a giant meta-analysis, which is covers much of what we want to focus on, and the other one is just an individual study from Thailand, and it has some merit, right? But having said that, the meta-analysis was more so on U.S.-based schools, and I think that we want to focus on that more than the Thailand study. But I did include it in there, and well, having said that, I don't think it comes out as clear as it should, just in terms of the correlation. I think in part that might be because we have I don't want to say a limited range, but it could be, and I'm not entirely sure on that aspect, but we'll cover this as we get there, and we'll talk about some of my personal recommendations and why I feel the way I do on each trait, as well as their subcomponents, so each aspect of each trait. right? So like intellect and openness for openness to experience, right? Or like assertiveness and enthusiasm for extroversion. So we'll break these things down and we'll talk about them as we go forward. But I feel like that's a good introduction to where we're going to pick off here. So starting off here, how personality tests are made and conducted. So as you guys can see on the right-hand side, we got a little diagram here breaking down the personality traits. We got the little facets of each trait. So there's 2 facets for each trait. This is proposed by DeYoung et al. And we also got the subfacets here. So bear in mind this little photo here. And we're going to be just discussing how these are made to begin with, right? And also how we're going to conduct them. So personality tests are made by taking large banks of questions. And these questions can be, almost anything, right? Like I find joy in life, right? Or I often feel anxious around other people, right? Or I tend to want my opinion heard over the opinion of others, right? Just you can take a million questions, right? And then you can test a whole bunch of people with these questions, right? And what you can see is some questions are going to be more correlated to each other than others, right? And these questions are going to eventually break themselves up into multiple different domains. And in this case, there's going to be 5 different domains, and these are going to be the big 5 personality traits. And you can break them up a little bit even more. And you can have so let's say we have the trait agreeableness, right? We can break that up into 2 other facets, so compassion and politeness, right? And then we can look at what type of sets of questions are going to be under compassion, right? So tender-mindedness, altruism, trust, right? And so we can break these things down, but there's going to be 5 big traits that present themselves in the research here, right? And so you're basically just going to take a factor analysis of the questions, right? And then so you're going to break down, you're going to get all the different traits here, and we can get a test, and we can assess for maybe we put 10 questions or 25 questions for each trait. That's like a good representation of what the overarching trait is. And maybe that can be comprised of, or maybe we take 30 questions that could be like comprised of like 5 of each of these subfacets, right? And maybe that's what we can do. And we can, have them answer a broad range of questions. So in this case, it was 30 times 5. We get 150 questions. And that 150 question survey or inventory is going to allow the candidates to self-assess themselves in terms of what they feel like. So if we got, I don't know, let's just say the order, right? Let's look at the subfacet order. We can make a question that says, I always feel like I need, like I always like to make sure things are in the right place, right? Period. I like to make sure things are in the right place. Now, what do you agree with that? Do you agree that on a scale of 1 being I don't agree with that at all, right? I disagree with it. Would be like a 2. 3 would be like you're indifferent to it. 4 would be I agree with that, and then 5 would be like I definitely agree with that, right? And so you can take these, and then you can look at the results by scoring the inventory. And you can see where they score in relationship to other people. So if you notice here on the PowerPoint, we said results only manifest themselves, they only manifest meaning in comparison to other people, right? So if you have a test all by itself, right, it doesn't matter. It means nothing, right? The results only mean things in comparison to other people, right? And the reason for that is we're going to look at percentiles, and that's how these things are scored, right? So it's not that and a great way to visualize this, right? And I've always found that this was like the best way to visualize this. Now, IQ is not a personality trait, right? But IQ, let's say you have an IQ of somebody who is, has an IQ of 100, right? And then maybe you got a person who has an IQ of 150, right? It's not necessarily that they are 50% smarter, right? The person with the IQ of 150, they're just 50 points above the person with the 100 IQ, right? And they're going to be looking at percentiles, right? So the person with the 150 IQ is going to be in the top 1/10 of scores, and the person at the 100 is going to be at the dead center, 50th percentile, right? And so it's not as if there's like you can't score 0, right? It's not something that you can score 0 on. And because of that, these results, they only mean things in comparison to others, right? So you could be in, the 99th percentile in extroversion, take a trait that everybody tends to know before we get to cover them a little bit more in depth. And that's going to mean that you're one of the most social people that's out there, right? Also probably very, very assertive, right? And, that's only a manifestation in comparison to other people, right? That only means something if there's, 100 other people out there who have lower scores than you on average, right? And so you have to assess very large pools of people for these tests to mean anything. And the ones that have been designed, they do have large pools of people. And well, having said that, you can get a good idea of what a person's personality is. If there is no people to compare with. But having said that, I don't really think that the results are as meaningful. And the reason for that is because it's like, okay, we just have your results, right? It's like there's nobody else who's taken it. It's like you don't really know where they're going to score yet. So even if it looks like you're scoring, yeah, I agree. And you seem like to be like you're the most extroverted person in the room, like you think you are based on your test scores, but then it turns out you're not really that extroverted compared to other people, right? So that's why you want to have lots of people score these tests. And it's very important to note the results are probabilistic; they're not deterministic. And I think people oftentimes get hung up on these personality tests and all these tests of either general cognitive or personality. It doesn't really matter what. And I think the reason is because people, I heard this before, and this just stuck with me. It was people, they like the idea that people can have a good personality, but they hate the idea that a person can have a bad personality, right? And well, as a result for that, I don't know if maybe they're just projecting in the sense that they always think that they have the best personality. But what they're forgetting is these things do not determine who you are. And now, in large part, they are going to determine what your life outcomes are going to be, and they're going to determine how you're going to act throughout how you're going to perceive the world, and how you're going to act, how your being is going to act as you venture out into the world. But these are probabilistic, right? This is just so like, if you're very high in extroversion, right? It's like you're going to be way more likely to pick a career that involves a high degree of sociability, right? Where you have to interact with people on a daily basis, right? All the time. It's like, because otherwise, like, you're not going to be happy sitting at a desk all day with a very little social interaction, right? You might not be sad, right? Because sadness is the negative emotion circuitry, which is on neuroticism, right? But you're not going to be happy, and so it's not to say that an introvert, for example, can't be a car salesman. It's like an introvert could be a car salesman. They could even be a great car salesman. They could even be the best car salesman, right? But an introvert is not going to enjoy car sales, okay? And as a result of that, and with personal autonomy, a introvert is going to better align themselves in a role where they don't have as much social interaction on a daily basis. It's not to say they can't be good at it, right? But they're a little bit more skilled on one-on-one interactions. They'll be a little bit more fine talking with smaller groups of people, or one-on-one interactions, individual interactions, or they just they get tired out by social interaction, and so it takes a longer time for an extrovert to get tired out by it than it does an introvert, right? So extroverts feel a little bit more refreshed, right? And so you got to bear these things in mind. They're probabilistic, just means that you got a higher likelihood of something if you have one trait. They're not deterministic, right? It doesn't necessarily determine what your outcome's going to be, because you can always go against the grain in some ways, right? But that's what it will be. It will be going against the grain. And so when we're screening for these things, you have to remember that. As we're going along, because that's the thing where people really get caught up on, and I think rightfully so in some ways, right? But we have parsed that out, and so this is something where you really have to look at the probabilistic side versus deterministic argument, and really come to the conclusion that this is probabilistic, not deterministic. And also too, I think another thing people tend to get a little bit hung up on is that personality tests, personality in general is not really that malleable, right? It's very unfortunate to say, but there's some good evidence, some very, very, very good evidence that's come out. Robert Plomin, who's the person who's got me first contemplating this question, is how heritable is personality. And it turns out that the older you get, the more heritable your personality becomes. So that means the genetic influences are just absolutely thriving, right? And your environment does really little in terms of molding who you are, just in terms of your natural proclivities, right? And so, and in part, people get hung up on that, right? Because people would think to themselves, oh, well, wouldn't genetics manifest itself more at a very young age, right? Because if you're 1 year old, for example, you're just sitting in your crib, it's like, well, environment's not really impacting you that much. That's what most people will probably say right off the bat, without being acquainted to the literature. But it turns out that you don't have your own will, right? You don't have any control over your environment. And basically, just the nurturing element is just being completely subjected upon you, right? As an infant, right? Because you don't have any control over the environment. Everybody else has control over your environment for you, okay? And as you get older and you have more personal autonomy, you're going to essentially craft your environment in accordance with your own personality. And so if you're an extrovert, right, you're going to hang around everybody else who's also an extrovert. If you're an introvert, you're going to be with other people who are more introverted, right? And obviously these boundaries are going to cross one another. Introverts are going to be friends with extroverts. Extroverts are going to be friends with introverts. But just on average, and again, this is on average, probabilistic here, probability here, you're going to have more introverted friends if you're an introvert and more extroverted friends if you're an extrovert, right? And you're also going to be doing more extroverted activities if you're an extrovert than you would be if you were an introvert, right? And your career is going to manifest itself differently, right? And so all these different factors are going to come into play. And as you get older and you have more autonomy over your own being, this is where personality is going to really start to solidify itself. And by the time you die, it turns out that your personality it's like 80% heritable, 85% heritable in a lot of cases. And so one of the things we got to really take into consideration here, personality is not that malleable. So if you're hiring a teacher, for example, and they're an introvert and you want to make them into an extrovert, like that's just not going to happen, right? So that's not happening at all. And it's nice to think that we can try to do that, but that's not what's going to happen. Now you can make them do extroverted things, and nobody's arguing that, right? And they might be good at that, right? But they're not going to enjoy it, right? And so if you're really trying to pressure them and making them feel a little bit on edge about the role, they might end up looking to go to a different opportunity where they don't have to be as extroverted all the time, right? Maybe they can just sit in their classroom with their students, and they got a little bit less staff interaction, for example. Right, and so just because of the nature of the job, obviously it might not necessarily be the best example, considering the job's a pretty extroverted profession, where we're socially interacting with people all the time. But having said that, I think it's really good to bring up. And well, with that said, we are going to get right on into the first trait. So just bear these things all in mind as we're going through, guys, and hopefully we get on to the on a roll here. So, openness to experience. All right, so this is going to be the first of the big 5 personality traits that we're going to talk about today. I just put them in order of the common acronym that everybody tends to use, called OCEAN: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And so we'll just go down the line with the common acronym here. And again, what are we doing on this slide? We're going to be talking about what the trait is, right? How it's correlating with teacher effectiveness, and then I think I also got a sentence in there about why these correlations may be occurring. Right, but we're also going to expound upon that as well as we're talking here. So let's get a sip of water and we'll get to it. So trait openness is often going to be referred to as openness to experience, and so when I mention openness, I just refer to openness to experience. And it's going to be the first trait, and it's going to deal with one's ability to try new things, as well as engage in imaginative and intellectual activities. And so this is going to be coming from my paper on Big 5 Personality and Political Orientation here, just talking about what the trait is. And so people who are high in openness tend to be those that we would consider to be open-minded. The people who are willing to change their minds or try new things that other people would not. It is also the people who tend to find pleasure in unconventional forms of stimuli. So, for example, somebody who is high in trait openness will be more likely to paint a wall in their house purple, and actually enjoy that wall being purple more than somebody who is lower in trait openness, who would be more likely to stick to a conventional color. And so, for example, you can think like a white or beige or gray. And they'd be more okay with such an unconventional stimulus, that most people would shy away from. And this is in part because they can envision it more abstractly and are willing to venture outside of whatever socially constructed domain is being perpetuated in a given population. And so an easy way to imagine this is that if most of society accepted that purple walls were stylish and everybody had them, then those who were the least likely to adopt purple walls are those with higher openness, as you would have to be willing to venture outside of the current domain, one where people mostly adopt purple as a color scheme for their walls. Right? So people higher in openness to experience are also those that are going to be interested in ideas. And so if you're talking with somebody that is high in openness, they will likely try and switch the conversation to a discussion about ideas, usually abstract ideas, right away. And so openness is a trait that is going to be heavily correlated with general intelligence and IQ, as we're going to talk about here in a second. And as a result of learning faster than average people do, you'll be more likely to look at new ideas that are more abstract, as it is a natural progression that one will face as they venture throughout life. And so essentially the reason that those with high openness are more interested in abstract ideas is because they're able to process more information quickly, and it's a little bit easier for them to learn. And they're going to just be naturally thinking of these new ideas, right? And as a result of moving outside their boundaries, how can they push those boundaries, right? And so their imagination is always going to be running. And so while openness itself is just one trait with the so while openness is just one of the big 5 personality traits here, and this is what we've been talking about here, we can break this down into 2 subcomponents, right? So we got intellect and we got aesthetic openness, or just openness, right? Now it's kind of funny because openness to experience, so you get the actual trait here. So if you're noticing down here on the little diagram, we got openness breaks down into 2 little facets: intellect, aesthetic openness, and then we got all little subfacets there. You can just think of openness to experience as being the one in the big box, and then openness itself, or just aesthetic openness, is the facet there. But that's what we're going to be referring to here. So there's 2 widely accepted aspects of this. So we're going to break it up here: intellect, aesthetic openness, and so they're going to be both heavily correlated with each other. So if you're higher in one, then you're more likely to be higher in the other, and vice versa. The intellect aspect of trait openness is the aspect associated with qualities such as creativity, imagination, a love for abstract ideas, the ability to understand complex ideas, thinking quickly, having a rich vocabulary, and the ability to handle a large amount of information, and the ability to formulate ideas clearly and concisely. So intellect and IQ are almost exactly the same, right? You can almost intertwine them with each other. But there are individuals who do have high IQs that are low in trait openness, and as a result of this, they're going to be low in intellect as well. So this is why IQ is not a personality trait itself, and openness is going to be separate from this, right? But IQ is sort of overlurching it all, right? And so the openness aspect of trait openness is going to be the aspect associated with qualities such as enjoying the beauties of nature, aesthetics, a love and need for art, a love for music, the ability to see beauty in things others do not, getting lost in thought more than others, daydreaming more than others, a love for literature such as poetry, and the ability to notice emotional aspects in paintings or pictures. And like previously mentioned here, the openness aspect of trait openness allows one to enjoy more stimuli that others simply they just can't understand, or they wouldn't even bother to try to understand in the first place. And so an easy way to explain this as an aspect, or even trait openness as a whole, is that like trying to explain something that is outside a given domain to somebody low in openness that is operating within that domain is like trying to explain color to somebody that is colorblind. And that was a wonderful quote that I heard in a lecture from, I believe it was Jordan Peterson. He was at the art gallery in Toronto, and it's a really good lecture. He's a wonderful personality researcher that I found, and as I'm sure you guys know, for his politics, but he's a wonderful personality researcher, and he was discussing a lot of the work on creativity, and people tend to think, and this is a big misconception with openness, and particularly the creativity side of things. People tend to think that creativity is everybody's creative. It's like, that's not true, right? Like if everybody was creative, then the term loses all of its meaning, and it's just as wrong as saying that everybody's extroverted, right? And so you can actually screen for creativity relatively easily. And it might be a little bit harder on self-assessment, but even if you just had a candidate in an interview, for example, and you were to tell them what would be a good little test. I believe one of the more common tests is if you just take somebody who so you say, name as many words as you can, and you got 60 seconds, right? Name as many words as you can that begin with the letter B, right? And so you count down. Whoever has the most words, right, they're probably going to be the most open person, right? I believe I got that right. And so those lower in openness, they're not going to be wired the same as those higher in openness. And as a result of this, there's a major disconnect that occurs between individuals on opposite ends of the distribution. Like, it's nobody's fault one way or the other. It's more so just fate manifesting itself in people's personalities. And so, well, with that, that's a nice little overview of openness, I believe. And so, we got a meta-analysis, or so in the first study that we're going to look at here. This is by, I'm not too sure exactly how I pronounce this name, but I think I got it right. Smithy Cry. I'm not too sure if I got that wrong. I'm sorry, but somebody could correct me in the comments, perhaps. But it's going to be positively correlated with job success. This is for teachers, specifically for teachers. This isn't just job success overall. This is specifically teacher job success at 0.17, right? So the more open you are, right, the more effective you are going to be as a teacher, right? And now this is where the bulk of the information comes from. So we took a meta-analysis, or I didn't take a meta-analysis, but Kim et al. Did in 2019, and they ran a meta-analysis on 25 studies, and they excluded I think it was 900 studies for this too. So they really broke it down a lot on specific criteria, and so they took teacher performance and Big Five personality traits among 6,294 teachers. And so this is a pretty big, sample size. I think so, especially in terms of personality research. And they're going to show a positive correlation of 0.10. And so that's a pretty good correlation, in my opinion. I don't think it's necessarily as reflective as it should be, but for the role, I can see it, and I can definitely see it. And I think in part why this seems a little bit lower than it is because of the different grade levels. And so, but we'll talk about that as we get to one of our last slides, which is my own personal recommendations. We'll cover that a little bit more in depth, but the research is showing a positive correlation between openness to experience and teacher success or teacher effectiveness, however you want to call it. And so the reason for this is going to be a positive correlation with general intelligence, experimentation, and creativity. And so let's just break it down real quick, right? If you got a positive correlation with general intelligence, and so openness is very, very highly correlated with general intelligence, and I believe it's correlated about 0.7 or so. And so that's a really high correlation for those of you who aren't necessarily the most keen on correlations. That's really high. You never see a correlation of 0.7. That really shows you that you got something there. And so 0.7 is huge. So it almost goes hand in hand. It's almost synonymous in some ways with general intelligence, but again, it's not, because the aesthetic openness side of things, right? That's just sort of how likely you are to step outside of the boundary, right? So you got to quantify that, right? Because that's different than intelligence, right? You can be open, but you might not necessarily be as intelligent, right? But it's correlated, right? So you will, on average, be more intelligent, right? And so there's a positive correlation with that. It's going to lead you to do more experimentation in your classroom, right? So if you're going to try out a number of different processes and a number of different teaching techniques and strategies and creative ideas such as projects or just any different approaches to pedagogical approaches to trying to teach your students, eventually you're going to recognize which ones work the best and which ones don't work the best. And in part, this is also going to work hand in hand with creativity, right? And so how creative can you be, right? What kind of ideas can you come up with that the students might like? And, there's going to be a learning curve on this. Don't get me wrong. But as you get over it and your teachers, you gain more experience because you've just tried more things throughout the years. I certainly see how openness is going to play a big role in that. So in some ways, you're almost screening for intelligence by screening for high openness, right? And you're also looking at teachers who are always going to be constantly trying to push the boundaries. They're going to try to venture out of that current domain and try to try to make the lives of their students as best as they possibly can, right? So if you're an administrator, what you want to be doing is screening for high openness as high as possible, right? And again, it could be that hey, look, you got some wonderful teachers who happen to be low in openness, and that's perfectly fine, right? A lot of these bureaucratic positions, if you're a principal, you want to have some order, right? You're not necessarily the most open person because, what is there to be open for? Now, having said that, administrators and teachers, they tend to be a little bit more open to people on average. Having said that, even if you're not as high, you might score the people who are a little bit more higher in openness because you think that their ideas are crazy, because that's what you will think if you're lower in openness, because you're not going to be able to, because you don't visualize it the same way. Again, remember, right? Like looking at an idea that's outside of your realm of perception is almost exactly the same as trying to explain color. So if you're trying to explain something that's not in the realm of perception in accordance to openness, right? It's like explaining color to somebody who's colorblind, right? It's not necessarily, and you might even be resentful at that, but you shouldn't be, because it's not that they're being mean or that they're trying to be resentful of whatever your idea is, or they're aggressive towards it. It's just they simply cannot understand it. And so if you're going to try all these new things in your classroom and you have an administrator who's a little bit lower in openness, what could end up happening, especially as you look on the bottom end of the spectrum, they're going to be screening those candidates a little bit more poorly. And it's unfortunate. And also, too, I also believe, too, in the starting years of teachers, right? So if you got a teacher who's very high in openness and they're still young, within their first, 5 years, for example, maybe, and because, let's just use professional license as criteria. So let's say in their first 4 years as a teacher, they're going to be trying out all these new ideas, right? And even the ones who are lower in openness, they can be trying out new ideas, but the ones who are in openness, they're probably going to be trying out even more ideas. And a lot of those ideas are going to fail because, openness is a very high risk, high reward strategy, right? It's like when it succeeds, man, it exceeds wildly, right? But you're going to fail most of the time, right? And so this is why there's some utility in being a little bit more conservative in your temperament, because that's really what it is. And when I say conservative, I quite literally mean more conservative in your temperament, because it's more so like a stick to what you know strategy. If something's working pretty okay, right, why change it, right? If you see it's working good, there might be something that's better out there, yeah, and you're not going to know until you experiment, right? But most of the things that you try are going to fail, right? But the ones that do succeed, they're going to succeed wildly. And so that's really how you want to visualize it, and that's right. That is so right. And that's what I've been taught when I've studied this, and from the lectures that I've watched from Jordan Peterson and other researchers, like that is spot on. And so it's correlated with these things, and rightfully so. And so you really want to take into consideration openness as you're hiring, and try to make sure it's as high as it possibly can be. And so with having said that, we're going to move on to the next trait in our little OCEAN acronym, and this is going to be conscientiousness. So conscientiousness. I almost had to blow my nose there. So conscientiousness. Starting off here, again, we'll give a little overview of what conscientiousness is. We're gonna I'll read a little bit from my paper that I published on Big Five personality and political orientation, and we'll be talking as we go through it a little bit, and we'll be breaking down the analysis here from the peer-reviewed studies, and also talking about why these results manifested themselves to begin with. So the second of the Big Five personality traits, again, conscientiousness here, and this is going to reflect a family of constructs that describes individual differences in a propensity to be self-controlled, responsible to others, hardworking, orderly, and rule-abiding. People who are high in conscientiousness are those that we would consider to be quote-unquote workaholics in our society, and not just workaholics, but also those who are perpetuating a particular system. So, for example, somebody who is higher in conscientiousness will be more likely to work 70 hours per week than somebody in the opposite end of the distribution. People who are high in conscientiousness do not mind working long hours, almost as if they can not be doing something that is unproductive. A person high in conscientiousness will look at somebody on the other end of the distribution as if they are lazy or not as hardworking. And there's often no recognition of temperamental differences at work that allow the person high in trait and conscientiousness to work long hours without getting as exhausted as those who are lower in conscientiousness. People who are lower in conscientiousness need more leisure time. Otherwise, they are miserable. Whereas conscientious people need, whereas more conscientious people need less to feel the same way. So in addition to working very hard, individuals higher in conscientiousness are the type of individuals who you may know that always have to have their house spotless in terms of cleanliness, as conservatives tend to be a little bit more disgust sensitive, as well as just want to maintain a state of order. And so again, this is sort of synonymous with conservatism here, right? Because they want to maintain order. They want to keep intact their own system. So when we say conservative, we quite literally mean conservative. We want to keep the status quo. We want to be very, very sparse in our risk in terms of pushing outside of our boundaries, right? So when we say conservative, we quite literally mean it, right? And yes, it means political. It can be construed politically, but it also can be construed in any environment, right? So you want to be conservative in any environment. So that's what we're referencing here. So we're going to be breaking it up into its two different aspects here. We got industriousness and orderliness, as you can see at the bottom of the screen here, and the two facets, industriousness, orderliness, breaking off of conscientiousness there. And well, starting off with the industriousness aspect of trained conscientiousness, it's going to be associated with individual qualities such as the ability to orient oneself towards a goal and foster its manifestation through hard work and annoyance with time wasting, finding it easy to get down to work, avoiding procrastination, working quickly, and not being easily distracted. Industriousness encompasses hard workers in society who are heavily goal-oriented. Goal-oriented, that's key to remember there. And they're also going to be bothered by people who distract them from their goal or are not working as hard as them, right? It's almost in the sense that they, if you really think about it, like they can't understand why people don't have similar work ethics to them, right? Again, it's not in their realm of perception, right? So again, this is personality driven. It's not that they're doing this consciously. This is an unconscious forces manifesting itself onto a person's innate proclivities. So the interesting thing about conscientiousness is that no matter what domain a conscientious person, or I should say industrious person, is placed into, they're going to be extremely productive, just as the person who is extremely creative will be extremely creative in any domain that they are subjected to. Right? So for example, a person with high conscientiousness was to move from managing a coal plant to then managing something entirely different, such as a restaurant. They would work just as hard managing the restaurant as they did managing the coal plant. So productivity may be lower at first as they need to garner expertise in the new industry, but over time they're going to end up being just as productive. And so the driver there is going to be trait industriousness on conscientiousness. And so, well, having said that, the second aspect is going to be orderliness, and that's going to be associated with individual qualities such as the desire for an organized environment, a love for order, keeping things clean, scheduling events and sticking to them, an annoyance with unorganized or messy people, and a desire for perfection or sticking to a routine and abiding by the law or upholding rules. So people who are high in orderliness are going to be the people referenced above that crave cleanliness. But it's not as simple as only cleanliness, as those higher in orderliness crave order as it is defined by themselves. So for example, a person high in orderliness might despise messy rooms, but they may have their own room organized in an unconventional manner, but still fostering order as defined by the individual. So if a person were to mess up on the rooms to rooms of two people, each with the same levels of orderliness, but with two different systems of organization, then the orderly people would reorganize the rooms in accordance with their own unique value structures. Right? So I think that's really important to recognize. So if you're orderly, yes, a lot of this stuff is going to be dictated via social norms. It's going to be correlated heavily to those social norms, like a clean house, right? But also too, you got to think about our own systems of organization. Like we all have our own little pet peeves when somebody moves something completely out of place, and you're like, why would you do that? And you almost get upset in some ways, right? If you're disagreeable and you're very orderly, so you'd be like, why are you messing up my entire realm of perception? Like, why are you messing up my whole environment? Like, my world is shifting, right? It's like, I want this to be exactly how I want it. And so, as you guys have probably guessed, people who are very high in orderliness tend to be those who have OCD. And so they're going to want things exactly how they want it. And when you mess it up, that is going to be something they're not going to like as much, right? It's going to be an offense to them in some ways, right? Not an offense to them. Well, it could be an offense to them, but it's not something they're going to be necessarily too keen to. And so the origin of trait conscientiousness, it's going to be somewhat of a mystery. In the upper ends of the distribution, its utility is most likely derived from the need to regulate an environment so that chaos is mitigated, resulting in a more stable and predictable environment that poses less of a risk to you and members of your in-group. While it almost appears to be common sense, it is a mystery how such upper ends of the distribution arise because individuals must sacrifice other parts of their life in order to maintain such a drive on the industriousness side, though the practicality of orderliness is more apparent. I imagine that since life was unbearably difficult for most people throughout most of human history, the need for a temperament surrounding hard work arose. The practicality of conscientiousness is still evident today as well, because conscientiousness is a great predictor of career success as defined by monetary achievement and status. It's refreshing to know is a good indicator because indicator of career success as well, because that means society is becoming egalitarian, as the people who rise up the dominance hierarchy are the most hardworking, though many other factors are still present. So I figured I'd include the last part of my little paper there, discussing just how conscientiousness came to be about, right? And I think its practicality, it really cannot be understated. And so we mentioned the career success portion of things, and this goes for any career. Conscientiousness is going to, throughout the board, it doesn't matter what career it is, it's going to be associated with career success, right? And so you can take any career: plumber, right? Electrician, right? Teacher, McDonald's worker, right? You can take CEO. You can take an accountant. You can take a person on an oil rig. You can take a manager of a subway. It doesn't matter where. It doesn't matter who, what, where. It doesn't matter anything, any of that, right? Conscientiousness is always going to be one of the best predictors of job success, right? And get a little drink there. And for teachers, that is going to be no different. That's going to be no different for teachers. And so just looking at the literature here, conscientiousness is going to be positively correlated with job success at 0.33, according to Smithacry, 2007. And we got a meta-analysis of 25 studies as well. And so, and by the way, the sample size for that first study there, I believe it was about 250 people. So pretty large. And then we got a meta-analysis of, I say pretty large, for personality research, it's pretty okay, but a meta-analysis of 25 studies on teacher performance and big 5 personality traits among 6,294 teachers showed a positive correlation of 0.13. And so that's pretty good. That's pretty good. Generally speaking, when you're looking at trait conscientiousness, you're going to get about a 0.13 for really, almost every profession, right? A little bit higher in a lot of professions, right? But that seems to be on par with what the literature's saying, especially when you're looking at other professions as well. And so I believe we cited a study here in the back in the reference side. It was Robert et al, which is what we're going to be looking at here. So just to make these comparisons, but why is this correlated positively with success as a teacher, right? Well, increasingly dependable work ethic is going to help predict success, right? That's almost what it boils down to, right? If you're very high in industriousness, right? The higher you are in industriousness, the harder your work ethic is, right? Think about it. If you're working extra 10, 15 hours, you're going to have way better lessons than a teacher who's not working those extra 10, 15 hours, right? And now, again, there's a big learning curve, right? So most of what you get is going to be up front, right? But these things are going to get fine-tuned quicker. You're going to get better lessons, especially over time. These differences are going to accrue. These differences in work and the amount of time put towards perfecting your craft are going to accrue, and you're going to have a better teacher as a result of this, right? So you're essentially cutting the learning curves in half, and you're also not in half, it just tremendously. It could even be more or less than half. Doesn't really matter what, but you're cutting the learning curves down, and you're also going to you're cutting the learning curves down, I guess, generally speaking, even over a span of 30 years, right? Hopefully you're still trying things out by then. You're not just sticking to the same old lessons, right? Now, obviously, a lot of lessons are going to be the same, but you still want to be striving for the best new lessons in accordance with both the data, in accordance with just what you see, just what you've seen throughout the years, right, and what you've tested for, which I guess is the data. But yeah, so we're gonna be looking at conscientiousness to positively predict teacher effectiveness, and I would also say that orderliness is also probably something that you also do want to screen for positively as well. And I mentioned this in my own personal recommendation section. And the reason for orderliness is being positively associated with teacher job success or teacher effectiveness, I think it's because we have to be bound by a system of rules. And the classroom is not supposed to be a place where it's just a free-for-all, right? Now, you have models where it's more or less a free-for-all in some ways, right? But the students in those models they're socialized by a bunch of rules, and they're bound by a certain cultural structure where there's already expectations in place, and they are already products of that system, to where they're not like, to them breaking a rule, it's not going to be negatively impactful on the learning environment. Whereas in a place that's not akin to that's not necessarily where the students are not as socialized to the expectations of a given society, you're going to have you're definitely going to have to keep those rules more at the center of focus in your classroom, right? So just for example, right, raising our hand to get out of our seat, right? It's like maybe in Finland that works, right? Where you don't have to have them raise their hand, right? And it can be more of a free-for-all in some ways, right? But there's an expectation that if you get out of your seat, you're not going to run around screaming or throwing stuff or talking to people or whatever, you know? And so, whereas, you know, in the U.S. system, in a lot of places, and again, this is completely dependent on what school you're actually at, right? It could be that, you know, it's not a good thing because, you know, they get out and they disrupt people. I know that's the case in my classroom. I have them raise their hand, and that's because we want to establish some of these rules, right? We don't want them just wandering around. We want them focusing on the lessons, whatever that lesson may be. We don't want them being in disruption. So, to learning of other people, right? And so, you know, I think it is a little bit more rule heavy, and I think in environments, and I think the U.S. could be considered one of them. In environments where rules and the teaching of societal customs is a little bit more pronounced in a lot of ways. And when I say societal customs, I mean societal expectations in terms of how we are supposed to act, in terms of how we should portray ourselves in the workforce as we go about venturing throughout our careers post-graduation. Maybe that's a good way to put it. I think that orderliness helps solidify those rules in the beings of our students, right? And so, like, you're not going to change their personality, but maybe you can change the societal expectations, or give them a somewhat of a reality check or a viewpoint into societal expectations, and you can hopefully try to mold how they're going to behave as a result of that, right? So you're altering the environment, and their personality is going to stay the same. So they're still going to navigate the environment, but you can change the environment. So they're going to navigate that different environment differently, right? And as they learn throughout time, okay, this is social stuff. I can't do this, or I can't do this. They're going to learn that you have, like, look, if I gotta go run out somewhere, I gotta raise my hand before I go run out into the hallway, right? I can't just go unattended somewhere, right? And now this may be different depending on where you work at. In most places, obviously, you can just leave. But having said that, it's more so the expectation in the sense that we don't want you just leaving and going about messing around, right? And so it's more so just establishing things so we can try to help them as they venture out throughout the world. But I think there's that sense of orderliness there. So the more orderly you are, the more likely you're going to be to abide by rules in whatever structure that you're placed into, especially if you value those rules, right? So again, we talk about orderliness and value and our value structures. So especially if you're valuing the rules that your administrator is putting forth in your district, and as well as your state and your federal government, you're going to be more likely to perpetuate that system, right? For better or worse. You're going to be more likely to perpetuate that if you enjoy it. And so, or not even necessarily enjoy, maybe that's the wrong word, if you agree with it, right? Or it's a little bit more applicable to your own personality, and how you view the world, and how you value things, your value structures. And so, orderliness is definitely a trait that I could see possibly being correlated as well. But industrioususness is the bulk of this, right? And so when you're screening for conscientiousness as a whole, right, industriousness is really what you're looking for. But orderliness as well, I could see that being positively correlated. But if you're not as orderly, that's fine. You know, there's nothing wrong with that. I think it could go either way. But I just wanted to mention that. I had to mention that because I do think that's an important distinction, especially if you have a test that's going to distinguish between the different facets as well. And most of them are just going to be the big five. So you're just going to get openness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism, and conscientiousness. But, you know, for, you know, the tests that do break it up, you're going to want to look for orderliness. I'd say go positive. You know, I'd say definitely go positive. And maybe the older you get, the less orderly you need to be, like in terms of like grade level, right? So maybe in kindergarten you need to be way more orderly because you need to have more rules. and they got to learn what society has to offer, right? And what their future academic careers have to offer. And so that way, by the time they get to the first grade, maybe as a kindergartner, they understand certain expectations already, right? And so we want to be thinking about these things as administrators. We want to be thinking how we can go about screening for candidates who have these traits, right? And how it's going to fit in our own unique school. All right, so let me get a little sip of water here, and we'll get on to the next trait. Extroversion, the trait that everybody knows and loves dearly. Now, everybody always talks about extroverts, right? But what is an extrovert? Well, I can tell you. So we're going to, again, go back to our article a little bit here. So this can be commonly referred to as Introversion Extraversion. And it's going to be the third of the big 5 personality traits that we're talking about. And it's going to be, which is a, quote, higher order dimension of personality reflecting tendencies to experience and exhibit positive affect, assertive behavior, decisive thinking, and desires for social attention, end quote. So people who are high in trait extroversion are characterized by energy, dominance, spontaneity, sociability, whereas more introverted individuals tend to be described as more lethargic, inhibited, reflective, and quiet, end quote. Most people are familiar with the trait of extroversion, as it is the most widely talked about outside of academia. But extroversion is a bit more complex than people make it out to be. Right? People are correct in pointing out that highly extroverted people are the socialites in society, the people who are always talking to somebody or doing some socially oriented activity, as they just enjoy the company of people. But extroverted people are also, however, those that will show increased levels of positive emotion in comparison with their peers in the way that a mitigation of trait neuroticism does not accomplish. A mitigation of trait neuroticism, the last trait we will talk about, would result in a decrease in negative emotion, which is different than an increase in positive emotion. Somebody's capable of experiencing little negative emotion and lots of positive emotion, but they may also experience little positive emotion as well, and there's no guarantee either way. Lastly, the highly extroverted people are those that tend to be the leaders in a given dominance hierarchy, as they are very assertive, which grants them the gift of persuasion and leadership qualities necessary for commanding sets of people. So, extroversion is the positive emotion side of things, right? And so when you want to compare extroversion to neuroticism, oftentimes people oftentimes, and you'll definitely see this, people don't necessarily know as much about personality, but they tend to think that if you're, right, like if you're, say, high in positive emotion, right, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't be high in negative emotion as well. You can be at two different extremes, operating simultaneously, right? Because they're at two different spectrums, right? There are two different circuitries in the brain are responsible, for the for these pathways, right? So extroversion is correlated with positive emotion. It's associated with positive emotion, whereas neuroticism is going to be associated with negative emotion, right? So you can be, not having, you can not have much negative emotion, but you might not be happy, right? You can not be happy, but you might not necessarily be sad, right? And so they run off two different circuitries in the brain, and that's a very big distinction that we have to account for. Because it's not like we can just screen for one personality trait and then know how a person is going to be in terms of their, emotional stability, more or less. I don't know if that's probably the wrong way to put it, but emotional stability, because that's neuroticism in some ways, or the inverse of it. But in terms of their emotions, I should say. So we want to understand that these are two different traits, right? So people who are lower in trait extroversion are going to be those individuals who get exhausted by social interaction. Oftentimes, these are the people who do not go to as many social events, or the kind who want to leave earlier when they do. If a highly introverted person, someone low in extroversion, were to go to a party and want to leave early, it is not because they're being rude. It is simply because they get exhausted by what others might find revitalizing. And so introverts are also the people who somewhat lack a sense of humor in a broader sense, being that their levels of positive emotion and even expression of positive emotion are hampered by their temperamental proclivities. And so lastly, introverts are also those that are unlikely to work in leadership positions in environments where social interaction is common. An introvert would be more likely to attain a leadership position where they are able to separate themselves from social interaction most of the day, which would result in an overrepresentation in fields such as computer programming, law, or accounting. And obviously there's still large amounts of social interaction there. But having said that, in comparison to other roles, probably a little bit less. So if one thinks about it logically, it's almost going to be a truism that such people would be more equipped for such roles, as long as they're able to stay assertive when needed. Because if in if an extroverted person were to sit at a desk all day, little social interaction, they would wither on the vine. Right? So, breaking extroversion up into its two facets here, we got two aspects. We got enthusiasm and assertiveness. And so the enthusiasm aspect of trait extroversion is going to be associated with individual qualities such as making friends easily, keeping people around oneself, easy to get to know, having lots of fun, laughing a lot, getting caught up in excitement, higher impulsivity, very enthusiastic, and expresses their feelings more outwardly than others. Individuals high in enthusiasm are those that always have a smile on their face, and they love social interaction, much like a stereotypical extrovert does. And their impulsivity tends to them being lost in the moment at times, as they are wired to take advantage of fun and enjoyable things, while fun and enjoyable things are there. And so it might seem like common sense to take advantage of fun and enjoyable things when they present themselves, but it is at the rate at which they take advantage of those things that's going to distinguish themselves from extroverted people. And so there's a little bit more impulsivity there. And the second aspect of trait extroversion, which is assertiveness, is going to be associated with individual qualities such as taking charge, a talent for influencing people, a talent for captivating people, seeing oneself as a good leader, very persuasive, very vocal about their opinions, and earlier to act than others. Individuals high in assertiveness make very good leaders, as they have the ability to command people into doing what they need in an effective manner. These individuals tend to favor careers whereby they can exercise control over others, though it is not for maniacal reasons, as they're just wired to seek careers whereby they are able to express their personalities into the world. So, for example, a job that a person high in assertiveness would seek would be that of a politician, for example, where the job entails influencing others to get what you feel is best implemented. Right? So, extroversion as a trait is going to be positively correlated with job success at 0.12, according to Smith-Acry in 2007, in their analysis, right? And so, as you can see, it's pretty heavily correlated right away with teacher success or teacher effectiveness. And the meta-analysis of 25 studies on teacher performance and Big Five personality traits among 6,294 teachers showed a positive correlation of 0.17, and that's Kim et al. 2019. And so extroversion is going to help with jobs that require more interpersonal contact on a daily basis, right? And so it's also going to help with assertiveness and taking control over one's own classroom. And so jobs require more interpersonal contact on a daily basis. Like, you're talking with people all the time, from the second you get in as a teacher to the second you leave, right? Like, I talk to people all day long. Like, the longest I probably go without talking to people as a teacher is probably 10 minutes. Right? Or maybe 15 minutes, right? It's not long, right? Like, I'm always talking to people all the time, whether I'm collaborating, talking about a teacher, about, just something, right? I'm always talking with people, right? Even on my planning period or during my lunch, right? And so you're always talking to people all the time, and you're always with students all the time. And you have to have these interpersonal connections of just constantly in your mind all the time, right? And you're going to be interacting with people. And as a result of this, you're going to almost have to be extroverted, right? And so otherwise you're going to burn out like crazy if you're not extroverted. And so this is going to help with assertiveness, and it's also going to help with taking control over one's classroom as well. So not only do you have to recognize that you're going to be interacting with people all the time. Like, if you're a teacher, that's what you do, right? You interact with people all the time, right? And it's going to also, you're also in a position where you have to be assertive and take control over your classroom, unless you want everybody else to run the classroom for you, and that's probably not going to turn out well, right? And so then they'll just be left to their own vices in some ways. And so you really want to have a candidate who is very high in enthusiasm, and probably pretty high in assertiveness as well, because they have to be able to take command. They have to be able to command groups of people to do things, right? And they have to be able to garner the respect of those people as well. And so just by being more interested in people, and looking at how I don't know if I should necessarily say that, but just being able to interact with people constantly and forming these relationships with them and becoming assertive. And so this personality trait's also going to play a lot in with agreeableness, as we'll see about here on the next slide. But you got to be able to take control, and you got to be able to have these interpersonal relationships by just even being able to, from a personality standpoint, right? Because if you're an introvert and you're going to try to be a teacher, it's like, yeah, you can be an introvert and be a teacher, right? But having said that, you're going to burn out like crazy, and you're probably not going to last that long, right? And so you're probably going to look to find some other role where you're not as tired every day, because you're going to go home and you're going to be dead, right? Even the teachers who are extroverted, they go home and they're just dead some days, because all they do is they interact with people all day long. And in some ways, teaching can be akin to other very high interpersonal contact positions, such as like a sales, for instance, right? It's like you're selling the content to the students in some ways, right? You're teaching it to them. They got to be able to buy into it, right? And they got to be able to value it, and you got to make it interesting for them. You got to be able to interact with them and give them help when they need it, right? And answer their questions. And there's a number of different things. You got to be able to dictate them and give them directions to do things. And so this interpersonal contact, it's almost no different than sales in some ways, right? But just in the sense of education, in the realm of education. And so, it's really going to help being more extroverted. And the evidence is clear on that. 0.17. We'll go with that for the meta-analysis there. That's a pretty high correlation. So the more extroverted your candidates are, the better, right? So if you've got two candidates who are exactly the same, but their personality is different, right? And even if you don't know the personality of your staff, you're not going to do a school specific analysis. It's like you probably should go with the extroverted person, and it's nothing against the person who's not as extroverted, but I'm just saying, like, it's probably a good idea, and so another thing that we're going to see here too is extroverts and people who are agreeable, like these things are going to go hand in hand in terms of molding relationships, right? Because like an extrovert might like being around you, but they don't necessarily like you, right? And so that's one thing that we really got to take into consideration as we're going on the next slide. So agreeableness here. So the next trait we're going to be talking about is agreeableness, fourth trait. And it's going to be character. And so again, I'm going to go back to my article a little bit here, read from the what I wrote down on what the trait is. And it's going to be characterized by showing a compassion for others, self-sacrificing character, the avoidance of conflict, and nurturing mentality. And people who are high in trait agreeableness are the people we think of that are very kind and will not spark conflict, even when their situation does not correspond with their ideal. Those high in agreeableness are willing to sacrifice what they want or need for what others want or need, coming at their own expense. Agreeable people tend to be the followers in society, which is partially because they hate conflict. And if you're leading a group of people in a work environment, for instance, the people underneath you are not necessarily going to be that fond of you, especially when you do something they do not like that is particularly distressful for those with higher levels of agreeableness. So if you are high in agreeableness, you have to give directions to people, and they don't like your directions. It's like, that's not going to be, like, they're not necessarily going to like you for that, right? And it's like, people think that, like, that's going to be something they're going to admire you for that, right? It's like, no. And it's like, so that's something that you're going to have to reckon with as a teacher, right? If you got to give them a direction or some expectation you got to set maybe, and they don't like it. It's like, how are you going to deal with that, right? If you're very agreeable, that might eat you up inside, right? But if you're a little bit more disagreeable, it might be something that you brush off a little bit more. So the best way to describe agreeableness is going to be by describing it as the motherly trait, being that it likely arose as a result to foster cooperation between members of the in-group, as well as the ability to care for infants or children without being upset. If there's an infant that needs a person's care and attention, then everything that infant does is right, and the infant cannot be wrong. And as a result, it is best if somebody who's willing to constantly capitulate for a few years is in charge of taking care of it. So that's like a little adaptation from a quote from Jordan Peterson. I really love that quote. That was a really good way of putting agreeableness, because it's like that's probably how it arose if you think about it. If you got a little infant there and they're crying over something, it's like you can't get upset at the infant. It's like they don't know any better, right? You got to take care of them, and so you just got to be able to capitulate in some ways your needs, right, and what you want for the wants of the children. And I think that this is one of the big personality differences that's going to probably contribute to the gender gap in the teaching profession, just in terms of who goes into it, right? Like the men versus women. Like women are way more likely to go into teaching than men are. And in part, that's going to be because of this personality difference here. They're going to be a little bit more nurturing, and more. They're going to be more interested in people as opposed to things. That's going to be another difference, right? But the big difference here in agreeableness is something that is not to take lightly. And so if a parent or guardian gets upset at the infant and neglects it, or conflict breaks out around the infant, then that infant is harmed, and which is not an effective long-term survival tactic in perpetuating the existence of one species, especially in a species where infants are entirely unable to take care of themselves. And so one of the largest gender differences in personality between men and women actually lies with women showing higher levels of agreeableness, likely for such a reason. So then we got our citations there: Weisberg et al. 2011, Peterson 27D, as we can see in the references there, or at the end of this presentation. But on the opposite end of the agreeableness spectrum, there are going to be people that are considered disagreeable, right? So when we refer to disagreeable people, those are just people who are lower in agreeableness, and they're going to be the people that they don't really care about your feelings, and they're more so out for their own self-interest. And disagreeable people are going to reject altruistic tendencies, and they're going to be willing to start conflicts in order to foster their own interest. So disagreeable people, they rejected authority under the mentality that they should not have to listen to you because they are better than you, and that is especially so when they're told to do something that they do not want to do. So for example, if a very disagreeable employee is told to do their least favorite task at work for the next 3 hours by their manager, then the disagreeable person will get very upset and strongly resentful over whoever gave them the order, right? Because they want to be in charge, right? They're disagreeable. They don't necessarily, and you could imagine how this is correlated with openness in some ways, right? But it's more so that like they want to retain the power for themselves, right? Like they don't want to be bossed around, right? They're not as agreeable, right? They're not as likely to go around. They want to be the one in charge or do their own thing. And so in order to better understand trait agreeableness, and by the way, it's like, yeah, these traits are correlated with each other. So there's correlations among the 5 traits, right? And so if you're high in one trait, you might be a little bit higher in another. So these things, they are interconnected with each other, and there's a wonderful graph. I probably could have included it, but it's not necessarily as relevant for what we're covering. But these traits are correlated, so you're going to see some distinctions as we're going along here, discussing the different traits, because some of these traits are correlated. You could kind of make some connections amongst them, right? Okay, well, if a person's a little bit lower openness, then they might are probably a little bit blah 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 blah, right? So you can just go on. A disagreeable employee. So we got there. So let's break down the 2 aspects. So that's like a general overview of agreeableness, and so we have 2 aspects here, as we see at the bottom: compassion and politeness. And so compassion is going to be the one that's going to be associated with individual qualities such as strong interest in the problems of others, the feelings of others, and their emotions, caring about how others are doing, taking lots of time for others rather than oneself, having a soft side, and doing things for others. The compassion aspect appears to be more centered around people and a genuine attitude to nurture their well-being, whereas the politeness aspect appears to be centered on an avoiding conflict with people. So many people confuse compassion as the same thing as the enthusiasm aspect of extroversion, but that's not the case, right? So enthusiastic extroverted people like being around people in social context, but they might not care about you at all. They just like being around you. And so compassionate people will actually care about you, though they may or may not be adverse to varying levels of social interaction. So a little bit more followers in society, as you can see, and in the interplay there with extroversion, right? So it's not the same thing as enthusiasm, but compassion, it's more so like I'm willing to capitulate myself a little bit, so that way you can, it's like you're nurturing. You're very just nurturing as a compassionate person, right? And these things are going to be like you care about the people, like you really do. And so like obviously there could be somebody that you don't necessarily get along with, right? But you would get along with them more if you are compassionate than you would if you were less compassionate, right? So that's a good way to put it, right? So if you're compassionate, right, and there's somebody who you like, let's say you're just in the middle of the spectrum, right? And like let's say you got your own personality set in stone, you're at the 50th percentile in compassion, right? And now you got somebody who kind of annoys you, right? And all of a sudden you become all of a sudden you're in the 80th percentile in compassion. You're probably gonna find them a little bit less annoying, right? And if you already like them, you're gonna probably like them maybe even a little bit more. You're gonna care about them a little bit more. You're gonna be more caring in your connections to other people, right? So the extroverts are gonna make the connections, whereas the compassionate people are going to foster those connections in terms of their compassion, right, as well as their politeness, right? Because as we're gonna talk about here as well. So the politeness aspect is going to be associated with individual qualities such as respecting authority, avoiding conflict, not finding pleasure from fights, not taking advantage of others, avoiding imposing their will on others, hating to seem pushy, and not out for personal gain. The politeness aspect appears to be centered on avoiding conflict with people more than anything else. Right? Polite people do not like stepping on the toes of others, and instead would rather help them achieve whatever their goals are as opposed to competing with them. Right? So they don't necessarily like competition. Right? They want to help you. Right? And as a result, they're going to be a little bit more well-liked. Right? If you're an agreeable person, right, people aren't necessarily going to have any gripes with you because you don't want to step on their toes. Right? Now, that might make you resentful in some ways, right? Because if you're particularly agreeable and you can't, you almost can't get your own way. It's like all the times you're always, you're not necessarily seeing the reciprocity in a relationship, and that might be particularly distressful for you, right? And it might be harder for you to say no to certain things that you disagree with, right? And one of the that could help with, like, maybe some assertiveness training, for instance, right? Some you help with how assertive you are, and maybe it could also help a little bit with just in terms of trying to be a little bit less polite. It's like, it sounds weird, right? But you really gotta to think about, if you're a person who is particularly polite, what does that mean? You're not gonna have any conflict ever. Like, if you're a teacher in a classroom, it's like you're gonna be in conflict all the time with students, especially in places where the disciplinary issues are a lot more common, and you got to deal with them every single day. Like the environment that I'm in, I mean, like, you're in conflict all the time with people, right? And it's unfortunate, but that's just the way that it is. If you don't stand your ground, you're too polite. It's like, that's not going to be something that you're necessarily going to want to screen for in a candidate, right? Because they're just going to get ran all over, right? And they're going to capitulate to the people who want to run the classroom. Those probably going to be your disagreeable students, right? Who want to listen to you as much. And so the politeness aspect, you want somebody who's probably a little bit less polite if you're looking at teachers. But we have one say it was at 0.16, and obviously that could be an anomaly, that could be an outlier. But the meta-analysis, which is where the bulk of the data comes from, that's going to be 0.03. And so I think what probably ends up happening here is you got to be very compassionate as a teacher, right? And so you want to care about your students. You want to try to foster those relationships with the students on a deeper level, and really get to know them and who they are and what their own interests are, and really make them feel nice and at home when they're at school. And you want to care for them, but on the same breath, you also have to be willing to engage in conflict. And so it almost cancels out the compassion side. So I think the ideal candidate would probably be higher in compassion, lower in politeness, right? And but again, it might be a little bit more dependent on the type of teaching environment that one is in. And so that's just sort of what I've been thinking as I've really been meditating on this. And I do think that higher compassion is probably the way to go. And you have to be able to relate to your students in their own individual situations, or you have to have compassion for that, right? It's like you demand their backgrounds. Man, some of these kids have such red flags, you almost can't even believe it until you get to know your students. One of the things I had a student one time, and there was a story about him, and he had some problems, and it's pretty bad problems. We've had like interventions with him and his parents and caseworker and all the other teachers and principal, and one of the things that happened like one of the days before was he was calling home because he was hungry, right? And he's probably not getting food at home, unfortunately, and the poor kid is starving, and he goes to call home, and I guess his mom just like chewed him out, right? Just berated him, and he hung up the phone. He's all teary-eyed, looks like he's about to cry. He's like, all I wanted was for her to give me some comfort, right? And just tell me things were gonna be okay. Right, and then she just got chewed out. It's like you almost can't even imagine. And the backstory of that kid was even worse than that. And so you can use your imaginations, but it was terrible. And so you almost can't even imagine what they're dealing with. So you have to have compassion for these kids. A lot of kids, they go home, they don't have any food. One of their only food sources might be at school. And so there's just so many things that you almost can't even think of. It's like their houses might be getting foreclosed on, or they're getting evicted, and right, it's a bad situation, right? Abusive parents and guardians and step parents and or step boyfriends or girlfriends or whatever. And so like it's not a good thing, not a good place. You have to have compassion for them. And so I think that has to be high. But the politeness, I think why we're seeing the correlation so low is because the politeness is going to cancel that out. I think you got to be a little bit more disagreeable, and that's going to be a really hard trait to assess for. Right, so you're going to want people right around the middle of the spectrum, right, in the middle of the distribution in terms of agreeableness. And I think that's evident, right? 0.03 correlation, that's almost nothing. That's just right in the dead center, right, of the distribution. So well, having said that, we'll get on to the last trait, of the presentation. So, the last trait that we're going to be looking at here is trait neuroticism. And so, moving on to trait neuroticism, this is the trait that's essentially the antithesis to extroversion, right? And that's very important to take into consideration. So this is where all the negative emotion of a person comes from. And neuroticism is actually a fairly easy trait to comprehend as well. And so, again, I'll read a little bit from my paper here that I published, and I'll just read some of the notes I have as well, and we'll elaborate as we go along, like we've been doing. And so, and we'll define what neuroticism is, and we'll give it, how does it impact teacher effectiveness, right? So, so trait neuroticism is commonly going to be referred to as emotional instability. And so the antithesis of neuroticism is going to be emotional stability. And so if you see something that says emotional stability, that is just like the dead opposite of neuroticism. Whereas neuroticism is the dead opposite of emotional stability, right? But the two go hand in hand. Some studies, it goes one way or the other, right? So I believe actually even the meta-analysis was on emotional stability. So it's just the inverse of neuroticism. And so you just put the correlation the other way, right? Because it's just the phrasing and the terminology. And so, well, having said that, neuroticism just goes hand in hand with emotional instability. And it is going to be the third of the fifth trait that we're going to be talking about here. And this is going to be our last trait. And as you can see, it's got its two subcomponents. It's all its little subfacets, and we'll break it down. So it's going to be associated with highly correlated negative emotions such as irritability, anger, sadness, anxiety, worry, hostility, self-consciousness, as well as emotional instability in the sense of regulating mood swings, usually in negative manners such as irritation. And neuroticism can also be viewed as a heterogeneous trait consisting of multiple facets that are highly correlated but partially distinct, including anger, sadness, anxiety, worry, and hostility. And the underlying factor associated with neuroticism is that higher levels are characterized with mood swings sparked by irritation or frustration, whereas those who exhibit lower levels of trait neuroticism are relatively stable in terms of mood regulation. So an example of somebody exhibiting high levels of trait neuroticism would be if somebody becomes enraged every time they get cut off in traffic, like unusually enraged, right? Like they snap almost, right? And they go from a completely normal state to a state of just being absolutely just almost deranged in some ways, right? And deranged is the right word, right? But we've all seen people with road rage, and the people who have road rage are probably a little bit more volatile in their emotions. And so, in order to better understand this, again, we'll break it up into its different traits of volatility and withdrawal, and we'll start with volatility. So, volatility is going to be associated with individual qualities such as getting angry easily, getting irritated often, getting easily annoyed, often losing composure, mood swings tending to go up and down easily, and moods not being able to be kept under control. And individuals high in volatility are known for having less stability in terms of their mood, characterized by a spark of negative emotion when their mood changes. The easiest way to picture volatility is by picturing a volatile stock market, where the market is moving up and down more erratically than normal over a given period of time, and apply that same concept to a person's emotions rather than the stock market, right? So if it's relatively going up with few ups and downs, this just tends to be going up. It's like that's a little bit less volatile. But as soon as there's like a million ups and downs as it's going up, it's like that's very volatile. And so that's essentially a person's emotions, more ups and downs, right? And more likely to do it more sporadically too. And so a withdrawal aspect of trait neuroticism is associated with individual qualities such as feeling sad often, being filled with doubts, being uncomfortable with oneself, feeling threatened easily, often feeling depressed, worrying about things often, being embarrassed easily, and afraid of many things. Individuals with high levels of withdrawal are those that are extremely self-conscious, self-loathsome, and often in a state of depression. These individuals would experience high anxiety in social situations as they feel as if they're constantly being judged by those around them, and trust issues accrue as a consequence. Right? This aspect of trait neuroticism can best be conceptualized as the antithesis of the enthusiasm aspect of extroversion, operating with entirely different circuitry. right? And we've known this since like the 1980s too, by the way, guys. Like this is like the study I cited here is by Costa, and Costa Cray, like they've done some wonderful work on personality, but Costa in particular here is talking about it here, and he, it's like this is the opposite circuitry here. Like neuroticism and extroversion, two totally different things. And you really got to take that into consideration. So the enthusiasm aspect of extroversion, happy, right? Think of all the positive emotions, right? Withdrawal, all the negative emotions, right? And so the withdrawal spectrum is going to be concerned with how much negative emotion one manifests, and the enthusiasm spectrum is concerned with how much positive emotion one manifests. Just because a person is low in withdrawal does not mean they will be high in enthusiasm or experience a magnitude of positive emotions. A person being low in withdrawal simply means they are not experiencing much negative emotion. It has nothing to do with positive emotion. Though some correlations could be made, there is not causal relations. So there's nothing causal about that. Right? So two separate traits. Very interesting. So anyways, how is this going to be correlated with teacher effectiveness? And how could we maybe use our personality data to hire the best candidates as a administrator in a school district? So the first study, again, by Smith and Crane, which this is one I really liked as well, was from Thailand. It's positive correlate with job success at negative 0.12, and or 0.21, I should say, at negative 0.21. And our meta-analysis of 25 studies on teacher performance and Big 5 personality traits among 6,294 teachers is going to show a correlation of negative 0.10. That's going to be, again, by Kim et al., 2019. And so we're seeing a really big, correlation in the sense that the less neurotic you are, the more effective you're going to be as a teacher. And the less neurotic teachers, they're going to be more stress tolerant, right? And so they're going to be more resistant to the litany of negative emotions that come with high levels of neuroticism. It may cause teachers to not perform to the best of their ability. And so, so I was losing my train of thought there a little bit. But yeah, really, we'll just, again, read that back. Less neurotic teachers will be more stress tolerant, right? So if you're more stress tolerant, you're able to handle more, right? Like you can take on more responsibility because you're not going to be feeling as these negative emotions won't be coming on to you all the time. You're not going to be having these self-introspective psychoanalyses of your own being, and it's like, am I good enough for the world? Am I good enough to be here? There's too much anxiety going on with my environment. I don't know if I can take all of this right now. It's like I'm so scared of the unknown. It's like I'm feeling self-conscious. Am I not good enough? Right? I'm sad. When I come here, it's like so people who are less neurotic, right? They got a big advantage in terms of their stress tolerance, and again, it's also going to play in with industriousness. But they're going to have a big advantage in that realm, and then they're also resistant to all these negative emotions, right? That are going to come with higher levels of neuroticism, and this is going to cause these teachers not to perform to the best of their ability. Like they might be miserable in some ways, right? In particular, if they got a bad day, right? All of a sudden, it becomes an even worse day because they're more neurotic than a person who's less neurotic, right? And so if the people have the same days and they're in the exact, so take two different people, exact same personalities, right? Now all of a sudden you tweak one of them to be in the 95th percentile of withdrawal, right? Well, now all of a sudden, like if you put them in the exact same situations, right, that are stressful and particularly draining, and just in terms of emotionally draining, I should say as well. It's like the person who's in the 95th percentile of withdrawal, like they're going to have a way worse time than the person who's maybe say at like the 40th percentile, for example. They're going to be way better off if they're going to be way better off than the person who was at the 95th percentile because they can handle something. They don't got to deal with all the added negative emotion, right? And maybe a teacher, maybe a student comes up to them and they say, look, it's like, you're doing a terrible job. It's like, God, you don't even know what you're doing. It's like, why don't you just like quit? It's like, you shouldn't be a teacher. It's like, God, it's like, why do you even come into this profession? Blah, 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 blah. And it's like questioning all these little things about them. And maybe the teacher's doing a completely normal job. The kid just says this to them, right? It's like the person who's lower in neuroticism will be able to handle it a lot better than the person who's high in neuroticism, because the person high in neuroticism, again, they're going to have that introspective reflection, which is where they're on edge as a result of that, man. They're not going to like that one bit. And it's not saying that like anybody's going to like that, right? But the person who's more neurotic, it's really going to get to them, right? And they're going to start questioning themselves as a result of this, and it's going to impact their work, right? Particularly negatively, right? They're going to be loathsome over it, right? And obviously other aspects are going to play into this, but that's something that you really got to take into consideration. So neuroticism, I think, again, it's a fairly easy one. Somebody who's a little bit more volatile, if you're a principal, you probably wouldn't want to really hire them, considering that their emotions could flip-flop right away. Maybe a kid does something at them that really, for lack of a better term, just pisses them off, really gets them upset, right? Like a kid, I'm very low in neuroticism, and so I had a student throw a pencil at me one time, right? And now they weren't trying to hit me, right? But they were trying to hit somebody else, and then it ended up hitting me, and because the kid ducked that they were trying to throw the pencil at, right? It's like some teachers, man, it's like if you're really high in neuroticism and you're really volatile, it's like you might just snap, you might just get hostile on them, and you might look like you're about to you could do some really bad things in the classroom. And I don't know if you really want to take that liability on as an administrator, right? So you got to be very careful about who you're hiring, because if they're really very volatile, again, look at the little chart, angry hostility, right? It might manifest itself in aggression. You might end up having a person who ends up going to attack a kid. So if you knew they're in the really high percentiles of volatility, it's like you don't want them to go and attack a student or something for something that happens to them, or get really upset or start screaming out or lashing out at you or their coworkers, because you just don't like the way that something happened, right? So you want to have somebody who's a little bit more stable in their emotions, able to tolerate some of these offenses. And that's something that you really got to be looking for as an admin, in my opinion. I think the volatility is the most important aspect, and I think the withdrawal, you can get around it, especially if a person's getting maybe some help, some psychotherapeutic help, or maybe they're getting some psychopharmacological help, I don't know, maybe they're on antidepressants, for example. But you really want to and if they're on antidepressants, they probably wouldn't score as high in neuroticism to begin with, too. So that's also something you got to take into consideration, right? Is, again, these things are not really that malleable, right? But they can be to a great extent with medication, right? So but if they're already on medication, they're still high in neuroticism. It's like you're not going to change that. It's like you can try, right? And some therapy might help them, and some other new medications might help them, right? But you want to be pretty sure that what you do is probably not going to help them as much as you would like to, right? And so they're going to need to seek professional help, and you can't recommend that to them, obviously. It's like that's their own business, and violating that would be a breach of their own privacy and what they're going through. And so you just want to take it into consideration, and it's unfortunate, right? Because it's not something that we choose to have. Nobody chooses to be depressed, or nobody chooses to be impulsive, right? But that's just the way that it is, right? So if somebody's very volatile, it's like you want to take that into consideration. Like, what could that mean? If I see somebody scored in the 90th percentile for that, what could that mean if I put them in a classroom with a bunch of students? It's like, and particularly students who misbehave a lot too. So the environment also plays a big role in that, right? It's like it also plays a big role in how our personalities are going to be, manifesting themselves. So do take that into consideration, and it's not something to just brush off. So having said that, we'll get into our one of our last second last slide, I believe it's the second last slide. So school specificity versus research-based approach. And so school specificity, so since the research only shows the correlations, your school's perception of an ideal candidate may be different from that of another school. And so for school-specific data, so we'll break down how to get school-specific data here. So one of the things you might want to do is, so these meta-analysis, they're going to tell you what traits that you might want to screen for in a candidate, right? And these are probably going to be, generally applicable to almost every school, right? And certainly some traits such as conscientiousness and extroversion, like those are gonna and neuroticism is like those traits and openness. It's like really every trait besides agreeableness. It's like you just want them to be positively. You just want to be look, as high in openness as you can probably get, right? As high as extroversion as you can probably get, right? It's like neuroticism probably as low as you can probably try to get. And conscientiousness, you probably want it to get, as high as you can get reasonably with all things considered, right? And so, like, generally speaking, like, a lot of this stuff is pretty clear cut based on the data, right? Like, they're positively correlated. And that's not to say that you can't hire a candidate who's not like that, right? Nobody's saying that at all. I mean, again, these things are probabilistic, they're not deterministic. As we can refer back to our second slide, we said that, or the third slide, one of the two, third slide. And but having said that, we also really got to be cognizant that might not fit our own individual needs or wants or desires, for that matter, right? So if you want a school-specific approach, what are you going to do? Right? How can we go about getting school-specific data so I can screen for candidates that I think that I'm going to like? So for school-specific data, you can administer Big Five personality test inventories to your most effective teachers, right? So let's just say you take your 3 most effective teachers, right? And so let's say you got 30 teachers. You take the top 10%, you get 3 teachers, right? Now you're going to take their personality results. You're going to score them each individually, then you're going to average out those results. And so you'll get maybe, let's say your candidates are now you got an average percentile for your best teachers, your most effective teachers, in accordance to how you deem the most effective. And so you can use your rubric data for that. You're scoring teachers in accordance with the state. You can use your rubric data, or you can just use your own personal intuition. Rubric data is probably a good reflection, and probably highly correlated with your own personal intuition, because otherwise they wouldn't have scored highly on their rubric data. But having said that, you can use maybe even a mixture of both or whatever. But it doesn't really matter. However you do it, you're going to get you can average out the results, and then what you can do is you can screen the candidates based on those scores. So you can try to screen for candidates that most closely resemble the average score of your most effective teachers, right? And so you got to remember too that your most effective teachers, they're probably going to align themselves with the traits in accordance with the literature, right? So like the teachers higher in openness, like, yeah, they might be maybe you want teachers lower in openness at your specific school, right? But openness is still probably going to be correlated with teacher effectiveness, right? And so you really got to bear that in mind as you're going about screening for your candidates. And so obviously you could do an individualized approach, and I think that's perfectly fine. But you also might want to think about the longevity of your own school, right? Because if you are an administrator there and you're only going to stay there for another 10 years or 5 years or 2 years, right? Maybe you don't want to screen for a candidate based on your own perceptions about what an ideal candidate should look like, right? And your own idea of what a good candidate is, right? And what a good teacher is. Maybe you don't want to screen for that. Maybe you just want to go based off exactly what the literature says, right? So maybe take the meta-analysis and you try to screen people in accordance with what is most closely resembling what it has to offer, right? Just in terms of the general traits themselves. And so maybe you can try to get a school-specific trait. So maybe you could test everybody at your school, right? And then maybe you could look at what percentile the people are in, and you could look at which percentiles you want to try to aim for. You could do something like that, yeah, and that's totally fine. But you also want to think about the longevity, right? So on average, what traits are going to be best, right? It's like yeah, maybe you like teachers who are introverts, right? It's like, but and maybe you think that they're the best, right? It's like, but maybe the person who comes in 2 years from now, right, they don't think that. And most people who are in those administrative positions, they are going to be a little bit more extroverted, and those good teachers are also probably on average going to be more extroverted, right? So so if you had another person coming in, they're going to screen for try to get the best teachers coming in on their staff as the years progress. They're going to probably want them to be extroverts, right? But now they're in a whole staff full of introverts, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. But what we are saying here is that maybe they're a fine teacher and they're doing great, but maybe they could be even better, right? And maybe we could have screened them to get the best candidates in accordance with the literature and what it has to offer on a personality side of things. So all things considered, right? Like obviously there's a whole number of other factors that come into play when we're talking about who we're going to hire as a candidate. But you really do have to think their personality is going to be the driver in a lot of anomalies that we would consider to be positive, right? So like if you look at people who are in like honors programs, for example, or people who are summa cum laude, it's like their industriousness and openness is probably going to be pretty high on average. It's like obviously you can have people who are very intelligent, but lower in openness, right? So maybe openness doesn't work for everybody, right? But generally speaking, on average, people who are higher in openness, they're probably going to be a little bit smarter, right? And they're going to perform a little bit better. And in terms of conscientiousness, they're going to be they're going to perform they're going to work harder, right, on average than other people are, right? And so I believe the general rule of thumb is I won't say that because I guess it's kind of off topic, but these personality differences is what you really want to take into consideration on a broader level. I think that you really want to look towards the literature on this one because the differences are going to change between administrators, right? And what might work for one might not work for another. And if you have your own individual bias, right? Again, we're trying to reduce bias with these tests. So you might want to try and take just the approach of what we know to be a good teacher based on the literature. So, and obviously you're a proponent of, you can include yourself in the literature, or you could screen your own teachers and include yourself in the data, but I don't think that that's necessarily smart because you're only just a small sample in the entire population that's taking the test. And so what I think makes the most sense would be to just screen based off of the literature and try to get as close as you can and use this one aspect, right? But you also have to remember that a lot of the achievements are going to be indicative of the personality. So like what we talked about with heritability and personality, it's like the environment plays less of a role than you think because your genetics dictate how you mold the environment, right? Especially as you get more autonomy as you get older, right? So again, if you're a you're an extrovert, it's like you're going to surround yourself and do things that are going to be associated with people who are high in extroversion. That's just what it is. It's like, yeah, you can go against the grain, but you're not going to be happy doing it, right? So really do take that into consideration. And lastly, we're going to go into my own personal recommendations here. And I just went with higher or lower because, there's not necessarily a set number here. Things are correlated, right? But, I do think that if you're going to go for an ideal candidate, and I think this is, and I think this is true of, of everybody, for all teachers considered. And I think the literature reflects this in large part. This is what you want to go for. And this is my own personal recommendation. So this is, again, informed by the literature, what I know about personality because I've studied it a lot, what I know about recruiting because I've done it for 4 years. It's like, what do I know about this, right? And so this is my own personal recommendation, right? You want to look for a candidate who's high in openness to experience, right? Higher in openness and higher intellect, right? And you want to try to get them, I would say, go almost as high as you possibly can go. And the reason for this, especially over time, you're probably going to end up having the candidates with the best, who are going to be the best, especially over time. Because like what we talked about, openness is a very high risk, high reward strategy. Being creative is not necessarily the best thing. Like one of the things I remember from that lecture I was talking about at the Toronto, I think it was the Toronto Gallery of Art, with Dr. Peterson, is he was talking about how like everybody thinks that being creative is a good thing. It's like that's not true at all. It's like being creative, so it can be good, right? In this profession, I think it would be really good. But you got to remember that things over time are probably going to be a lot better than things in the immediate future, right? So like most new ideas, they're probably going to end up failing, right? They're not going to be as good as you otherwise would have anticipated, right? It's like, by no means is creativity, a blessing. It's a blessed curse in some ways, right? Whereas, so sticking to tried and true methods, right, and not branching out from them, it'll probably be more effective in the short term for quite a period of time, maybe a few years, right? But as the person with the higher openness and higher intellect over time accumulates more experience and they've tried out all the things, they know what works, what doesn't work, especially if they're sticking to their data and they're analyzing it, it's like they're going to have a big advantage over the person who's lower in openness, right? Because they would have tried everything, and now they have the best, right, things, and they're still going to be trying to improve their craft all the time. They're going to be trying to venture outside of those boundaries. So I think in the short term, right, I think getting a person who's a little bit lower in openness might be a little bit better, right, if they have less experience. But if they got a lot of experience, or or maybe they don't got much experience, but you only need them for a short period of time, you probably want a little bit lower openness, right? So really, again, it's dependent on what your environment is, what your school is, what you're looking for, what you're looking to get out of them. But I think generally speaking, like if you know they're going to be in the position for 35 years, right? They're going to be tenured in 4 years, and they're going to stay there for the rest of their career. It's like you pick the high openness person every single time. Not even a question. You pick them almost every single time. Right? It's probably the smartest thing to do. That's both higher openness, higher intellect. Right? Whereas if you need them for a short period of time, you probably pick lower openness, right? Because they're gonna stick to tried and true methods, and they're gonna get what needs to be done. Right? They're not gonna try out all these whimsical ideas that are most probably going to fail, but they might be wildly successful. And so over time, these successes are going to accrue for the higher openness person, whereas for the lower openness person, they're going to stick to these tried and true methods. They're still going to try things, obviously, and they're still going to tailor their craft, but it's just going to be at a lower rate, or decreased rate. And so if you need them for a short period of time, you probably want to take the person lower in openness. You're not going to try as many things. Stick to something that's tried and true. You're not going to fail as much. And so you probably want to pick them. And so I think that's the way to go, right? And I think the people who are higher in openness, they're going to understand what things work and what things don't work, right? And as they've tried new things out, they might try to tweak them, but the things will still be successful regardless. They'll just try to tweak out, little aspects of whatever, revise certain aspects of whatever lessons that they're planning, and try to make them a little bit more efficient in terms of their teaching, more effective in terms of their teaching as well. So, having said that, let's move on to conscientiousness. So, I would recommend higher industriousness and higher orderliness. And so we already talked about industriousness and orderliness quite a great deal. But higher industriousness, again, that's the work ethic component of conscientiousness. So the higher work ethic, the better off you're going to be. You're going to spend more hours in your craft. The more hours you spend, the greater advantage you have over planning and whatnot, and getting all your administrative tasks done, and more time you can spend doing a broad range of things, analyzing your data, etc., than you would be if you were less industriousness, right? Because you just wouldn't enjoy it as much, and so therefore you're going to need more leisure. Otherwise, you're going to get burnt out, right? So higher industrious people, they're going to be way, way more likely to tolerate the long work hours needed to thrive in a learning environment, especially up front. I think that's particularly true. But again, as things accrue over time, and you're going to be less industriousness, but industriousness is still going to play a big role, especially even regardless of whether you're a new teacher or a teacher with a little bit more experience. And so higher orderliness, I think higher orderliness is probably going to be the way to go, although it's not as important as industriousness, not nearly as important as industriousness. It's going to be important because, again, you want to make sure that your classroom is bound by rules. One of the things that I was listening to a podcast with I believe his name is Richard Tremblay. I think I got that right, Richard Tremblay, and he was talking about antisocial children and mitigating aggression in them as you go while they were in like grade 2 or 3. And so if you're familiar with the literature on antisocial children and aggression, really by the time they're getting past kindergarten, you want to try and you really want to try to get them socialized by about that time, right? So like you're looking at like 5 or 6, right? And because of that, and the reason you want that is because you don't want them to move on in grades and then be rejected by their peers, and they're going to become more antisocial. So you want to get them to understand how to play and interact with people, how to socially interact with people. But that's going to be bounded by a constraint of rules in some ways, right? And so one of the things that you'll notice with your students who are particularly antisocial, and when I say antisocial, I mean just in terms of like their ability to abide themselves by social expectations and rules, right? One of the things you'll notice with antisocial children say like the middle school level, for example, they are a lot of the times it's not necessarily that they're misbehaving out of malevolence. Like they're not misbehaving out of malevolence, right? Like if they're pushing people or shoving people or doing all these things that are socially unacceptable, it's not because they're doing it because they want to be mean. It's more so that they're doing it because they're not properly socialized, and so they're attempting to engage in play with their peers, but they just don't know how to do so in a socially acceptable manner, right? So it's so oftentimes you'll see them like try to tackle each other or play, but there's rules to these things, and so things that might be abnormal to us might be normal to them, and so you really got to take that in consideration. And so a classroom, especially the younger you are, is a place where you have to establish rules and you have to establish these expectations, and try to teach the students to act in a socially acceptable manner. And you really want to try to hone in on that, especially throughout the whole year too. Throughout the whole year, especially like at least towards those kids who you can identify as being antisocial. And we can all do that. Teachers are actually one of the best screening tools for antisocial behavior in kids, and it's particularly true because like a parent would say, the parent doesn't necessarily know as much. Like they might think that their kid's antisocial or prosocial, but they don't really know, right? But a teacher has an advantage because they see 100 different kids, right? So if a teacher sees 100 different kids, they can pick out where on the distribution kid X is, right? It's like, where is kid X? Are they more prosocial or are they more antisocial? And especially over time, they're gonna be even better judges of that character, sociability. And so orderliness, if you're very orderly, you're going to want to stay in the confines of the system that's established, right, with your rules. And you're not going to look as fondly on people who are breaking those rules. And so by establishing these rules, and especially if you're particularly compassionate, maybe you can try to foster a system to where your students can, to where your students are able to navigate the environment under the expectation that you've placed upon them, that they have to act a certain way whenever they come into your classroom. And as a result of this, and you got to tell them why, right? Like this is why we have these little rules, right? It's like this is because it's going to help you, as you go throughout your life. And they're not always going to be receptive to it, but one of the things you have to do is you have to just keep trying to hone in on it, right? Because that's one of the best mitigators of antisocial behavior, is just teaching them how to socially interact in a responsible manner. And again, they're not as malleable the older they get, right? So really, if you're going to try to mold their personality, you got to try to do it as young as possible, right? But so by the time they become middle school or high school, it becomes a little bit more irrelevant. But one of the things that you want to try to do is really focus in on. You really want to focus in on the exhibition of rules, as you're screening for candidates, because you want to see how they're going to uphold your own school culture. How are they going to uphold the rules that you have in place at your school? Are they just going to ignore them, right? Or are they not going to establish any rules in their classroom as well, right? How are they going to abide by these structures that are placed onto their own on their environment, right? And you have to understand that. And so I think that if you're higher in organist, you're probably more likely to follow these rules, especially if you value them, right? Now, obviously, it's a little hard to say if they're going to value them or not, right? Because everybody has their own value structures like we were talking about. But I think higher orderliness is something that you're going to want to screen for, because regardless of how they value these rules, at least in their own classroom, they're going to have some nice expectations for their students. And I think that's one of the nice things that we have to establish, right? Because there's going to be expectations at work, right? There's going to be expectations as you get into the job market. And we want to try to essentially recreate a model of learning to where there are expectations that students act in a certain way, just as if they would act as if they were in a work environment, no matter what it is. And so and again, it might not necessarily be completely applicable from one environment to the other, but it'll probably be correlated and it'll probably be similar, right? And so higher orderliness is one thing I'd recommend. And then we have higher extroversion, so higher assertiveness. If you're more assertive, you're going to be more willing to engage in some conflict in some ways, right? Because you're just going to be more assertive. Like, you're going to be able to put forth your own opinions first, and you're going to be able to dictate other people. You're going to be able to command them, right, at will almost. It's not necessarily that you want to do it like for malevolent reasons. It's more so that you just do it because that's just what you do. You're an extrovert. Like, it's not a conscious act, right? You just naturally, you're assertive. You just naturally overtake the situation, and you're able to command others in your classroom, right? And that's why a lot of leaders are extroverts, right? People who can command others, like all the presidents, they're extremely assertive, right? They're extremely extroverted, right? And they're leaders. They get large sets of people to follow them because they're assertive. And they also have higher enthusiasm as well. So they like being around people, right? And this is like the positive side of the emotions, right? They're more happy, right? They experience positive emotion on a more regular basis, right? And so they're experiencing more positive emotion, right? They're associating that with their workplace. So that's something that you're going to want to screen for. You obviously want the candidates who are going to be a little bit more happier when they're coming to work, right? Make the work environment a better place for those around them, and as well as their students, right? It rubs off on other people, to some degree, anyways. And so you want them to take control, and you also want them to take control of the situation, and then do so in a positive manner. So we got the average agreeableness. And the reason I said average agreeableness is, one, because the literature shows it like almost exactly, right? And I think compassion overtakes politeness a little bit, right? In terms of why we saw the positive correlation of 0.03. But in the meta-analysis. But we got a higher compassion, right? So if you're more compassionate, you're going to be more likely to sympathize with others, right? And you're going to be more caring about others. You're going to be more interested in people. And what's going on in their lives, and how you can try to help them. And I think that's perfect for a teacher. I think you really want to be high in compassion. You're also going to be more likely to take into consideration the lives of your students, right? And whatever backgrounds they have, good or bad. And you're going to be able to try to sympathize with that. And I think that's a wonderful skill for a teacher to have. So very high in compassion. And then lower in politeness. If you're low in politeness, I think that means well, not that I think that means. It's like, I think that you'll be more likely to not stray away from the conflicts. And so I think that'll be more, I keep saying I think, and I just find that hilarious because I'm trying to, okay, so if you're lower in politeness, right, you're going to be more likely to engage in conflict when needed, right? And you got to be, and especially if you're low in volatility as well, right? So if you're very stable in your emotion, and you're lower in politeness, then when it comes time to discipline a student, for example, you're not going to let them walk all over you, right? You're not just going to try to ignore it because you're too agreeable, and you would rather, or you're too polite. You would rather them break a rule and then you not call them out on it, even if it's a detriment to the learning of other children. Because you're too polite, and you don't want that to happen, right? You want to make sure that you're lower in politeness and you're willing to call them out, right? When something like that happens, but in order to do that, you have to engage in conflict, and you're not going to want to engage in conflict if you're too polite, and so you want to be lower in politeness, and I think this can be different depending on the environment, right? So again, I think that you do have to. This is why you might want to go for the school specific approach. Right, I'm not saying it's necessarily the one that you want to go for entirely, because I do think that if it would be contingent on the administrative reviews in a lot of ways and what they deem to be effective teachers. But having said that, you also have to take the environment and this type of students that you have into consideration. And so this is tying back now. So I anticipated this point here. So I really wanted to tie it back here to the school specificity PowerPoint slide. If you have a school that's a completely different environment than another school, it's like the average is almost irrelevant, especially if you know that the environments are completely different, right? And so, like, I can think of some schools off the top of my head in Northeast Ohio, where if you have a teacher who is, maybe higher in politeness, it's probably going to make no difference, right? Like, it probably really won't matter almost at all, because you don't have to engage in conflict on a regular basis, because the kids, they're probably really not going to break your rules as often, right? That you have in your expectations in the classroom, right? And there's already a sense of pro-social order that's established in the classroom on behalf of the children that are coming in. Whereas when you go to some other places, it's like you're going to need to be lower in politeness because you have to engage in conflict all the time, and it is unfortunate. It's not something that your teachers might necessarily like to do, right? But they're willing, or not necessarily like to do, or are willing to it might not necessarily be something that you would want to do in an ideal situation, but it's something that needs to be looked upon in terms of personality if you're going to be looking to hire somebody. Because if you got somebody who's just going to get walked all over, and they're at and they're a teacher in the classroom, it's just going to be chaos. I've seen firsthand, very polite teachers who just get completely overran in their classrooms because it's just part of their temperament. It is no fault of their own, right? But if they're in an environment where there's large amounts of disciplinary issues and behavior problems, it's like you got to be able to deal with that, right? So this is where it becomes a little bit more specific in terms of the school to some degree, right? But I think that for most situations, you want somebody a little bit lower in politeness, and in order to do that, since compassion and politeness are again correlated with each other because they're both under agreeableness, it might be a little bit harder to try to find one who's higher in compassion, lower in politeness, right? But they'll be out there, obviously, and especially if you're looking at extremes. But it doesn't even necessarily have to be that extreme. But lower in politeness, for sure. I think that's something you want to do, especially because they have to be the person who's upholding the rules, no matter what environment they're in, whether they're in an environment where people break rules, sparingly, or if they break rules all the time, and expectations all the time. So you really want to have somebody lower in politeness as a teacher, and I think that's something that can't be honed on enough, because I think people will get a little bit frazzled when they hear that. But I think that's something that's true. And so lower neuroticism, you want lower withdrawal and lower volatility. So you want that increased emotional stability. So lower withdrawal, fairly straightforward. The less negative emotion that there is being brought into the classroom, I think the better. Right? I think that's pretty clear, and it's unfortunate, right? And the person can't help that they have lower, they have higher amounts of negative emotion, right? But if you got all these other candidates who have lower amounts of negative emotion, you've screened for that. It's probably not going to be that great of an issue, unfortunately. As non politically correct as it sounds, right? So you probably want to hire the person who is going to bring that more positive attitude into your classroom, right? Because there's going to be mitigation of negative emotion, and it's not going to hamper their work as much, right? And there's also going to be you're also going to screen for people with lower volatility, which we talked about, and is because you don't want the mood swings, the erratic mood swings, whether that's on behalf of staff or whether that's on behalf of the students, right? Like you could put somebody in a situation where maybe a student throws something at him, right? Like I've had a pencil thrown at me before. It's like some teachers might snap, right? And they could do something really bad. And maybe they could attack a student if they're very, very high in volatility, and you saw that screened in their personality assessment. Whereas another teacher like me, who's really low in volatility, it's like you brush it off, and unfortunate as it is, you gotta address the situation head on, right? And get the kid out of your class and in a respectful manner, and hopefully they can go about correcting their behavior as time progresses, and that's what you want to work towards. And so lower volatility, you really want to get somebody a little bit lower in volatility, I think. Obviously, like, there can be time and place, especially if you can hone your volatility for when there's a situation that commands it, right? But in most situations, I think it's more sporadic volatility, right? It's not necessarily that you have it at your whim. Like you can, you got to take control in the situation, right? You got to become very assertive right away. Lower your politeness a little bit, and this is more so random, sporadic, right? Personality, or I should say, manifestations of your character, right? So this is not like, this is more so just random, right? Like the stock market, it's just completely, it's random, right? It's almost not even, you can't predict it, right? And so the unpredictableness of volatility is what distinguishes it between, I would say, assertiveness and politeness, right? So I'd say lower volatility, right? If you can, and lower withdrawal. And so those would be my personal recommendations. And this is based off of a lot of personality research I've read throughout the years. I've been particularly interested in it since probably 2019. And, I've also been a recruiter since before then, from, I believe, 2015 to 2019. And, or 2018? I can't quite remember. I think 2019. And, 2015, 2019. And I was, under the presumption from the start that personality is always something to take into account, and what we're trying to do when we're in an interview, and this is just subconsciously, is we're actually trying to understand what a person's personality is, right? And this just gives a quantitative approach to gauging personality. So instead of just trying to do it qualitatively as a administrator in an interview, which interviews are notoriously pretty bad for identifying candidates, by the way, but you can do this quantitatively. There's no bias in it, right? You screen the candidates effectively, and you're able to see just by the pure numbers, right? There's no, maybe somebody does better in an interview than somebody else does, right? But maybe their personality is a lot worse, right, than the other person for the job, right? It's like, it's hard to say worse or better than another person's, but just in terms of the job, right? Is it better or worse? And maybe they ace your interview because maybe they're very extroverted, and they're compassionate, and they're able to, maybe they're a little bit higher in openness or something, and they're able to woo you in the interview, right? And all of a sudden you think that they're like the best candidate in the world, but in reality, it's like maybe they're not, right? And by taking sorry, I gotta get a drink of water real quick. And by taking a quantitative approach to, quantitative approach to personality assessment, I think that we're able to weed out a lot of those people who are just able to woo us in an interview, whereas somebody who's a little bit, less likely to do that, woo us in an interview, is going to shine through the cracks. And I'm not saying the interviews are obsolete. Like, certainly you should do a personality assessment along with recognition of achievements and past work experience and whatnot in interviews. But I do think that personality is one of the best ways to go, and especially if you weed out large candidate pools, and I think it could be one of the best things to screen for. And so that's just my own personal recommendations here. If I had to recommend anything above all, I would definitely say abide by try to get a test. This isn't a recommendation above everything else, but what I'm saying is try to get a test where you can actually break down the facets of personality, so you can get the big five, which is good enough, right? So obviously, if you got the big five by itself, that's good, right? And so you just screen, you don't even know what the facets are, right? So that's fine, that's cool, that's completely fine, right? But if you can break up the two facets, I would say get a test that can break up the two facets, and that way you can see a little bit. In particular, it doesn't really matter as much for teachers, but in particular, if you got a candidate who's almost identically the same, so maybe you want to look for something like with agreeableness, like the higher compassion, lower politeness. Because I do really think that's one critical aspect of being a good teacher, because this is because this is going to be bound to affect their classroom management. So if you're going to hire a good teacher with classroom management, like obviously that's one of the biggest things as a teacher, right? That's 90% of energy. It's like you want to focus in on that, right? Like what traits are going to affect that, and so you really want to hone in on that, right? And so that's what I would recommend for that. But a test with just the big five, totally fine, right? Perfectly fine, and I would recommend doing that over just if you don't have a choice of doing that. If it's that or nothing, like you definitely pick the big five, hands down. But if you can, try to get the ones with the facets as well. I think it would just be, that's what I would recommend. And so we got our references here. So give credit where credit is due. We got a bunch of citations here. We got I think 5 or 6 slides worth of citations. So we got a whole number thank you to everybody who would have contributed in all their past work. We really do appreciate you. And, we just try to synthesize some of this research here and really break down the personality traits, what they are, and, how we can go about screening effective teachers. And so, having said that, thank you guys all for watching the little lecture today. We'll put social media in the description. If you guys want to find me on there. I thank you all again. Couldn't thank you enough for sticking with me here, and hopefully we can get some more presentations like this in the future. If you guys have any questions, please be sure to leave them in the comment section below, and I'll be more than happy to respond to you with any I forgot a period here in the second citation. My bad. It's just my bad. But if I'd be more than happy to answer any questions, and just feel free to leave them down there. I can usually respond pretty quickly if I see it. And hopefully you guys have a wonderful day. Bye bye.